Hi everyone, it's Andrea Hawes from Elm Tree Education, and I'm back for another Lit Bit segment where I answer elementary school teacher questions about literacy instruction in just a little bit. I want to remind you that if you have your own literacy instruction questions, you should please go to the link below and submit them so that they might be featured on one of my upcoming Lit Bit segments and blog posts. All right, so if you weren't here last week, I started the 5 myths of science of reading, just that are out there floating around in the world right now. I talked a little bit about myth number 1, which is that there's a kind of a big misconception about what even is the science of reading, that it's not phonics or a program or some sort of methodology or philosophy. It's just the whole wide vast body of research coming from all sorts of disciplines that's helping us understand reading. Also, I talked a little bit about how not all kids are going to struggle with the same thing. And honestly, while we know that foundational skills are important and it's great that we have a almost like a refocus on them right now, it should not be focused so heavily that it's at the expense of other things. And you also shouldn't be doing some kind of one-size-fits-all intervention for kids who are struggling, because not everyone who is struggling because it's a word recognition problem. So if you missed last week's, go back and watch it, and so you can hear a little bit more about what I have to say about those 2 misconceptions. Now, let's get on with this week's. Okay. This is a big one. Well, they've all been big, but this is a big one. There has been a little bit of vilification of using certain words, certain thought leaders in education. And while I understand where a lot of this is coming from, and especially I can empathize with any sort of situation where a parent is having a kid who is struggling to learn how to read, and there's just been a real big disconnect for them. I understand where that is all coming from. What I get a little bit concerned about is losing nuance. And again, that there is like one side and another side, and that they are at war, when really we all just want kids to be able to read. So I think that for some teachers, I can't speak for all teachers, but for some teachers, I think having all this research come to light for teachers and being brought to the forefront, made them kind of question all the practices they've been doing for the however many years before that. And I can understand how that cognitive dissonance is hard. I can also understand why some people might be trying to hold on tight to some things that they've always done. I just feel like I can kind of see the big picture and I can get why it's happening, but that doesn't mean that I think it should be happening, because I really do think that while we do definitely have some practices that the research, if you go back to the research, and it's been time and time again validated, that there is some methods better than others, especially about the cueing systems, which I'll talk about in just a second, that there are kids, just like I talked about with misconception number 2, that are going to present with different needs. And I don't want people to feel like all the things that they have put in their little toolkit of ways that they respond to kids in their reading and the practices that they have done to encourage enjoyment and love of reading should go away. Because that's like, who wants that? Who wants to have kids who don't want to read and are highly unmotivated and not at all engaged? I mean, we don't want that. So, like I said last time, teaching reading is so complex. So complex. And I think no matter whether you are somebody who is a science of reading teacher, which again, I kind of said last week is like, that's dumb because it, it's a body of research. It's not a methodology or something that's like opposite against something like balanced literacy, technically. I think what's most important is that we are equipping our teachers with the breadth and depth of knowledge that they have to be responsive to the learners in the seats in front of them. You have to know a lot. You have to be a content expert when it comes to teaching reading. And I don't feel that we have been providing our teachers the level of professional development that they would need to become content experts. A lot of PD, professional development, has been around people learning how to use very specific curricula or a specific assessment or a specific intervention. And that gets a little bit muddy just because of who's providing that information, and I'll kind of talk about that in a little bit. But vilifying language, I'm not sure serves anybody. There are, believe it or not, some places where there are mandates that, thou shalt not even say anything that would be 3Qing language to kids. Thou shalt get rid of all level texts. I mean, there's been a lot of that kind of stuff. And I think that's just like a way, like, overcorrection of the situation. So what I would like to see is, yes, we need to have some explicit instruction. Yes, when it comes to a kid who is stuck on a word that they're trying to decode, that they're trying to read, and they're looking at the letters, we definitely want to prompt them to think about the sounds, the letter-sound relationships. And we definitely want to encourage them to maybe try another vowel sound or thinking about the word parts that are there. We definitely want those things to happen. But as a reader, if I'm encountering a word that I don't know, I don't just recognize automatically, then I'm going to look at it and I'm going to try to sound it out or use the word parts that I know. But then I'm also going to check by thinking about what's happening in the text, thinking about, how does English work? So would this be where a noun would go or an adjective would go or a verb would go? Like, we think about those things. It's not as if we say, child, you cannot look at the pictures. Child, you cannot think about what's been happening in the text thus far. Child, you cannot think about what you know about English and the rules of how we construct sentences. You have to have some of that semantic and syntactic knowledge because that's what we do. That's what our brains do. Now, again, what are you going to prompt kids for? Look at the letters, look at the letters, look at the letters, but check that you're right by thinking of the meaning and thinking of what would make sense. And so I worry that, again, when we overcorrect, we're going to like lose some of the good practices that we did have going on because now they have a bad name, and now that they are, don't say those words. Because there is really good practices that happen in all of these things. Now, the other bit that I think is something that this always comes back to in education is that words matter, and how you interpret a term and how I interpret a term may be completely different. What I think of guided reading and what you think of guided reading could be something opposite. What I think of when I think of balanced literacy and what you think of when you think of balanced literacy might not look the same. And how did I learn how to use the MSV as a way to analyze student errors and then also help my instruction might not be how you did. And so I think that there's also, again, we lose the nuance because it wasn't just one way everywhere. There was other things happening that were good that we don't want to lose. It's not either or, it's both and. Okay. All right. There's our last misconception for today. That the science of reading promotes just like this simplified, one-size-fits-all approach to literacy. And that could not be further from the truth. Like I said, it's so complex. We've been debating about this for decades and decades and decades. But you have to have these things work simultaneously. And you have to think about, again, if we think about this movement, what does the research say about a practice's efficacy? Is it even efficient? And how is equity involved? And this is actually coming from a talk that I listened to by Mark Seidenberg. You might have heard about him. He actually is the author of Language at the Speed of Sight. And, he's a pretty well-respected researcher out there. And of course, he's a proponent of listening to the science and following the science, but he just has a few concerns, and he just wants to make sure that we're not ignoring the concerns. And one of them is, this, yay, people want to know more about the science. That's great. But when has the research been oversimplified, actually? And also, some of the research was never peer-reviewed or been replicated, which in science, that's pretty key. Because no matter how well a respected researcher that you are, you can't rely on a single study. It has to be able to be replicated, and it has to have been peer-reviewed. And if it's not, then this is not something that we can take to the bank and say this is it. And like I said earlier, we haven't had enough research for us to determine the effectiveness in classroom settings. Researchers can share their information about their findings. And I think I said this last week, that there's sometimes there's a little bit of disconnect between what they find and then practice, right? Because they can't tell educators how to run classrooms because that's not where they did their study. Too many times they've done it in a laboratory, or they went to a school and they had a whole bunch of researchers come in and try an intervention on with kids. Well, most people don't have a team of adults coming in to work with their kids every day. So that's not really realistic in an environment that doesn't have that kind of control. So the other bit, especially when we talk about that simplified view of literacy, when we talk about the simple view of reading, which a lot of people refer to lately in their trainings, in their infographics, in their articles, in their books that they're writing about reading instruction right now, they're going back to the simple view of reading, which, by the way, came out when yours truly was 6 years old. And then they say, okay, well, yeah, but then there's also Scarborough's rope. That's still 20 years old. Over 20 years old. You can't ignore all the things that have happened after that. You can't just pay attention to those two frameworks and then say and then nothing good has come in the last 20 years. Because it couldn't be farther from the truth. There's been a huge explosion in research in the last 20 years. So when we find something like that there's some evidence that it works, we really need to find out now, well, who does it work for? How much of it do they need? Again, is it realistic in a classroom setting? If we focus on one thing more heavily, we're doing it at the expense of something else because we only have so much time in a day. And I will also say that a lot of educational materials make big, sweeping assumptions about who the kids are in the seats in front of you. They probably are designing these materials for kids who are white, have resources outside of the home. Maybe they have similar background knowledge and experiences. They come to school fed and no chaos at home. They also can understand the language the teacher is saying. And that's just not the reality for most of us. That's not who the kids are in front of you. So that whole one-size-fits-all approach to literacy, we already know is not going to work. I feel like this is something that we already established a long time ago, and yet we're kind of going back towards that in some of the curricula that is out there right now. Okay, speaking of those, what I say are somewhat dated views of reading. This is my favorite framework right now. I just feel like maybe it just makes sense to me in my brain based off of my experience. It shows that like word recognition and comprehension, no, there's actually ways that those are overlap. They're not really two separate strands. And I know Scarborough's like it weaves together and yada, yada, yada. But Cartwright and Duke, like they also are saying, yeah, but let's not forget about executive functioning skills. Like you have to have some pretty good self-regulation and some other skills in order for you to like attend to text and be engaged and motivated. And there's some strategies that you have to know how to use, tap into in order to recognize words and comprehend. And then those things in the middle, like reading fluency, vocabulary knowledge, having a lot of those print concepts, just even understanding the way that print is written in a text, and then being able to be flexible because of those, times where I could use my phonics skills to decode. However, in this context, this word is actually pronounced a different way and has a different meaning, those kinds of things. And then they also put in a lot about cultural and other reading specific kind of background knowledge that you have to have in order to really make those deeper connections, and also theory of mind stuff like that. It's just all really intriguing, this model. So I encourage you that if you are not familiar with the active view of reading, that you go to Nell Duke's website, or actually you can go to, I believe there's a free article on the reading teacher out, and I'll make sure that I link that in comments below so that you can find some of the information about this active view of reading and the role that some of these other things like motivation and engagement and executive functioning play, and these bridging processes, and kind of understand a little bit more. Gives a little bit more nuance to something that is complex. Okay. Whew. See, can you see why I couldn't do these in one full session? It was just too much stuff, too much good stuff to share. Okay. So we've ended part 2. So next week we will finish we'll finish all the misconceptions and some other just tips to think about as you move forward. And if you didn't watch part 1, I encourage you to go back and watch or read last week's blog post where I covered those first 2 misconceptions. And again, as always, if you have any questions about literacy instruction, please submit them at the link below so that I can hopefully answer them in one of my future LitBit segments and blog posts. Okay, take care, teachers.